Hello and welcome to your next lesson on the development of democracy. This is for years 8 and 9 and this is lesson 4. The first thing we need to do is our low stakes quiz. This is just our short quiz to check what we learned in the last lesson. So when I tell you to, you're going to pause the video, click the link in the video description to bring up your quiz, complete your quiz and then submit and check your answers. So if you can pause your video now. Okay, welcome back. So we're still looking at this inquiry question. What stories can we tell about the development of democracy in Britain? And today we're going to be focusing on this group of people. So if we're just going to have a think about what is happening in this image. We're going to pause the video. We're going to look really closely. Okay, and so some of us might be thinking that actually this looks similar to the event that we learned about last lesson. Last lesson we learned about Peterloo, where 100,000 people came to St Peter's Fields in Manchester to protest peacefully for the right to vote. Now, this is a similar protest. This is a group of people protesting, and they are called the Chartists because they wrote a charter saying what they wanted, just like a list. And here they are protesting peacefully for the right to vote. And as we can see, there are hundreds of thousands of people here. And so they're doing this because probably something to do with the right to vote, because that's what we're learning about. We're learning about the development of democracy. So our title today is How far had the Chartists achieved their aims by 1900? So when I ask you to, you're going to pause your video, write your title and write your date, underlining them both. Pause your video now. Okay, welcome back. Today we're going to be trying to describe the aims and methods of the Chartists and evaluating the extent to which 19th century reform met the Chartist demands. Now, reform just means change, changing something. That's what we mean when we say reform. Okay, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to look at the 1832 Reform Act. So it was a law brought in by the government in 1832 to change some things. Now, the 1832 Act, remember last lesson we learned about rotten boroughs, how Old Sarum, with a population of 7, sent 2 MPs to Parliament, but Manchester, with a population of 500,000, sent 0 MPs to Parliament. Well, the Reform Act tried to get rid of the system of rotten boroughs by giving MPs to cities such as Manchester and Birmingham, which had huge populations but no MPs. It also increased the franchise, so increased who could vote. So before the 1832 Reform Act, 5% of people in England could vote, just the richest people in England, really. And this was increased to 6%. Not a very big increase at all. And it increased to 6% because it said any person who owned property, so that means like a house or land worth £10 a year or more, had the right to vote. Now, at this point in time, £10 a year was quite a lot of money, so it only increased it to 6% of people. Not a big increase at all. And so, if we're thinking about that group of Chartists who we saw protesting before we wrote our title, well, probably they were still protesting after 1832 because 6% of people voting, having to own more than £10 worth of property, meant that virtually all ordinary working people did not have the right to vote. So it didn't really change it much for them. So we're going to do some true or false questions now. In your books, can you write the question number and then your answer? Remember, if you P or F for true or false. But remember, if you think it's false, I want you to put down what you think the true answer would be. Okay. So question 1, the 1832 Reform Act abolished rotten boroughs. T or F in your book? This is true. Question 2, following the 1832 Reform Act, new industrial towns like Manchester remained without an MP. T or F in your book, please? This is false. The franchise was extended to include all men and women who owned property. True or false in your books, please give it a think. This is false. It was extended to men who owned property worth £10 a year or more. Question 4. Please ignore the word small. Following the 1832 Reform Act, the franchise increased from 5% to 10% of people. Is this true or false? Write down your answer, please. This is false. It increased from 5% of people to 6% of people. Question 5. The ordinary working people did not benefit greatly from the 1832 Reform Act. True or false in your book? This is true. Well done if you got all of those correct. Now what we're going to do now is some fragments. Remember, you need to turn these into full sentences. Fragment number 1, increased the franchise to. The franchise is the number of people or the types of people who could vote. So in your books, I want you to turn fragment 1 into a sentence. These words here, increase the franchise to, might be at the beginning, the middle, or the end of your sentence. So if you pause your video now, okay, welcome back. I've written, by allowing any man who owned property of more than £10 a year to vote, the 1832 Reform Act increased the franchise to 6% of people in Britain. You might not have put something so detailed. You might have put the 1832 Reform Act increased the franchise to 6% of people in Britain. Or the 1832 Reform Act increased the franchise to men who owned more than £10 a year's worth of property. But it's better if you include as much detail as you can. Okay, our next one. Rotten boroughs was. We're going to put that at the beginning, the middle, or the end of our sentence. So if you can pause your video now. Okay, welcome back. I've written, the system of rotten boroughs was abolished, giving MPs to industrial cities like Manchester. You might have written the exact same thing, or you might have written something like the system of rotten boroughs was ended. You might not have used the word abolished. And fragment 3, ordinary working people did not. How can we turn that into a sentence? Let's give it a think. Let's write our answer, pause our video. Okay, welcome back. I've written, the 1832 Reform Act helped some rich people vote, but ordinary working people did not really gain from the changes as the system still did not give them the vote. Okay, because the 1832 Reform Act did not really help the ordinary working people. Okay, well done for your work there. The next thing we're going to look at is 1848. So from 1848, the Chartists began to protest. They began something called the Chartist movement. And the Chartists, they held huge outdoor public meetings. They created petitions which they got 1 million, maybe more, people to sign, which they then took to Parliament to say, this is what more than 1 million people want to happen. And they created their 6 Points Charter. Now, their 6 Points Charter said 6 things that they demanded from the government. Number 1, they demanded votes for all men. Number 2, they demanded that elections should be held every year. Number 3, they demanded equal representation in Parliament for all areas. So if you were in an area with 100,000 people, you would get 1 MP. So everywhere with 100,000 people, for example, would have 1 MP, rather than some areas with 10,000 people having 1 MP and some areas with 1 million people having 1 MP. So they wanted it to be fair. They wanted secret ballots so that no one knew who you were voting for and you could not be intimidated or bribed. They wanted to allow any man to stand for election as MP. And for that to happen, they needed MPs to get paid. Because if you're an MP, you'd have to give up your job. And therefore, you had to be a rich person to be able to do this, because only rich people could afford to give up their jobs and not get paid for doing something. So these are the 6 points of the People's Charter. This is what the Chartists demanded in their petitions and through their public meetings. What we're going to do is some true or false questions about the Chartists. Question 1. The Chartists were people who thought that ordinary people should get the vote. Write T or F in your book. Remember, if you think it's false, I want you to put why you think it's false. This is false. They believed all men should have the vote. They didn't mention women. Question 2. Chartists protested by physically attacking MPs. T or F in your book. Remember, if it's false, write down why it's false. This is false. They protested by taking petitions of up to 1 million signatures to Parliament. You might also include it by having huge outdoor public meetings. Question 3. The Chartists thought there should be elections each year. T or F in your book? This is true. Question 4. Chartists wanted fair representation in Parliament for all areas. T or F in your book? Give it a think. This is true as well. The Chartists wanted to keep public voting. T or F in your book? This one's false. They wanted secret ballots. Remember, then you can't be intimidated or bribed. Question 6. Chartists wanted only the rich to be able to become MPs. T or F in your book? This is false. They wanted any man to be able to become an MP, and so they wanted MPs to get paid for their work. Well done if you got all of those correct. Now the next thing we're going to do is some more fragments. Now this time around you're going to do the 3 fragments all in one go. So in your books you're going to turn "We're angry that" into one sentence, "meetings and taking petitions" into another sentence, and 6 points demanded into your final sentence. Okay, so if you can pause your video now. Okay, welcome back. My sentences are: Chartists were angry that the 1832 Great Reform Act had not given any ordinary working people the vote. There are other things they might have been angry about, but this is probably the main one. They still didn't get their voices heard. Fragment 2. The Chartists protested by organising huge public meetings and taking petitions with 1 million signatures to Parliament. And number 3, and this one there's quite a few different things you could have written because they had 6 points, and therefore you might have written about all of them, you might have only written about a couple of them. So I wrote, the Chartists' 6 points demanded that ordinary people got the vote, as well as making voting fairer and allowing all men to become MPs. Well done if you've done your 3 sentences and they're all good. The next thing we're going to look at is a selection of Reform Acts. We've already looked at one Reform Act, kind of the 1832 Reform Act, but that was not the only act which changed democracy in Britain in this period. Okay, so we've got the 1832 Act, and that increased the franchise from 5% to 6%. It abolished the rotten boroughs and gave MPs to industrial towns like Manchester, and it expanded the franchise to include all men with land worth over £10 a year, and so it's about 6% of the population. We've already learned about this one. Okay, the Chartists didn't think this one did enough. We go forward about 30 years, we have the 1867 Reform Act. Now this gave more MPs to industrial areas such as Manchester because they had more people living in them, so they should have more MPs. So this is kind of in going towards the Chartist demand of fair representation for all areas. It increased the electorate to 15% of the population by giving the vote to not only men who owned land worth over £10 a year, but also men who paid £10 a year or more in rent. So that increased it to 15% of the population. Still didn't really include many ordinary working men though. The 1872 Ballot Act only changed things to do with how people voted. So it introduced the secret ballot, which allowed voters to cast their votes in secret. Now this was one of the Chartists' 6 points. They asked for voting to be done in secret, and it was achieved by 1872. And the 1884 Reform Act doubled the electorate to 30%. So this included almost all men, not all men, but almost all men, but no women. And it set up a commission, so like a group of people whose job it was to ensure MPs were elected by an equal number of votes. So if one MP represented 100,000 people, they wanted all MPs to represent 100,000 people. So this again, this is one of the Chartist demands, so that the government is trying to meet it. This, the secret ballot, that is one of the Chartist demands. And this is one of the Chartist demands, but it doesn't quite meet it. It nearly meets it, but not quite. Okay, so that is 3 of the Chartists' 6 demands met or nearly met. Okay, true or false questions. We're going to answer these in our books. Question 1. There were Reform Acts in 1832, 1867, 1872 and 1884. True or false? Write your answer in your book. Well, this one is true. Question 2. The 1867 Reform Act increased the percentage of people who could vote to 25% of people in Britain. True or false? Write the answer in your book. This is false. It only increased it to 15% by allowing men to vote who rented property worth £10 a year or more, alongside men who owned property. Question 3. The 1872 Reform Act introduced the secret ballot, means secret voting. Is this true or false? This one's true. It did introduce the secret ballot. It's also known as the Ballot Act. Question 4. Chartists wanted fair representation in Parliament for all areas. True or false? This is true. They did want all MPs to be representing the same amount of people. Question 5. The 1884 Act created a commission to check that all MPs represented the same amount of people. Is this true or false? This one is true. And question 6. The 1884 Act increased who could vote to all men and most women. Is this true or false? Write your answer in your book. This one is false. It allowed most men to vote, but no women. So that's about 30% of the population. Well done if you got all of those correct. Even more well done if you put in why those ones were false. So put in the true thing for me. And now we're going to do some fragments. We're going to turn these into full sentences. Fragment 1, slowly increase the franchise. Fragment 2, Chartist demands such as secret. And fragment 3, more democratic as. Okay, you're going to pause your video and write these 3 sentences in your book. You can rewind the video if you need to check some of the explanation to help you. If you pause your video now. Okay, welcome back. Okay, fragment 1, slowly increase the franchise. I've put the Reform Acts of 1832 to 1884 slowly increased the franchise from 6% of people to 30% of people, including most men. Now, you might have just put the Reform Acts of 1832 to 1884 slowly increased the franchise, full stop. But remember, it's better if you can put in more detail. So we should remember that increased it from 6% to 30% of people. Chartist demands such as secret. I've put the Reform Acts followed many of the Chartist demands such as secret ballots to prevent voter intimidation and corruption. Okay. And fragment 3, more democratic as. So what I'm looking for here is to see that you've told me how Britain became more democratic as a result of these Reform Acts. So I've written, the Reform Acts made Britain more democratic as they increased the percentage of people who could vote and ensured fairer representation through MPs. Well done for your fragments. The final thing we're going to do is we're going to do some writing to see how far the Chartists had achieved their aims by 1900. Now, to help us do this, we're going to have a look through these aims. Votes for all men. Let's have a look here. Was this achieved? No, this wasn't achieved. We had votes for 30% of people, which included most men, but not all men. Elections to be held every year. Let's have a look. This doesn't tell us about elections being held every year, and that's because they didn't achieve that. Equal representation in Parliament for all areas. Let's have a look. Oh, look, we can see that in 1884 they set up a commission to ensure that there was equal representation in Parliament for all areas. Please excuse my not very good writing. We'll put that 1884 there to remind us. Secret ballots. Let's have a look. Yes, okay. Secret ballots were achieved in the 1872 Ballot Act. Allow any man to stand for election as an MP. Doesn't say anything about that. And payment for MPs. It also doesn't say anything about that. Actually, MPs did not get payment until a 1911 Act. So a good 20 years after the final Reform Act. okay? And it's after 1900, so it's outside of this time period. So what you are going to do, firstly, we're going to have a look at my paragraph, which answers the question, how far had the Chartists achieved their aims by 1900? And then you're going to write 2 more paragraphs. So let's have a read of mine first. Many of the Chartist aims had been achieved by 1900. For example, one of the 6 points was equal representation in Parliament for all areas. Number 3. Okay. This was achieved because the 1867 Reform Act gave more MPs to industrial areas such as Manchester. So if you're unsure of how I've written that, I've thought, okay, let's see which ones I've ticked. I've ticked number 3. So I'm going to put in what point 3 says. And then I'm going to find the Reform Act, which addresses point 3. And I'm going to say how it addresses point 3. Now, I would like you to do 2 paragraphs for me. 1 paragraph, you're going to tell me another of the 6 points that was achieved, and you're going to tell me how that was achieved, so what the act which achieved it said. And you're going to tell me 1 aim which they did not achieve. You've got lots of choice there, and you're kind of going to give me a bit more detail about that. So, like, how close were they to achieving it, for example. So if you pause your video now and use these sentence starters to write 2 short paragraphs for me. Okay, welcome back. I'm going to show you my 2 paragraphs, okay? So I've written, furthermore, another of the 6 points was secret ballots. This was achieved because the 1872 Ballot Act allowed voters to cast their votes in secret, reducing voter corruption. Now we're going to write one about something they did not achieve. Remember, there's lots of things you could have written here, but I chose to write about payment for MPs. However, the Chartists did not achieve all of their aims. For example, they called for payment for MPs. This was not achieved by 1884, and as a result, only the rich could stand for election as an MP, as ordinary people did not have the money to allow them to give up work. You might not have written about payment for MPs. You might have written about any man being allowed to stand for election as MP, or you might have written about elections every year or votes for all men. Any of those, if you wrote about any of those things as well, that is also correct. Now, we've just got 1 final thing to do today, and that's our exit ticket. This is just a short quiz to check what you've understood from today's lesson. So when I tell you to, you are going to pause the video, click the link in the video description to bring up your quiz, complete your quiz, and then submit and check your answers. You should be really pleased with your work today, and if you can pause your video now.